So Harmony was one of the loudest people last night, and so her voice has a very particularly sultry hoarseness today.
I woke up this morning with no voice because for the last few days, have been talking a lot. I just have to apologize now. And all I can say, this is a new thing for me. I am not used to being a woman without a voice. Okay, so I will be sipping away here while Jarrett and I talk. So
yeah, I guess I'll just have to take the burden of talking all the time. So before we start, I wanted to just say a few things about my feeling about this show, and also part of why it is such an honor and a privilege to get to be on the stage with Harmony Hammond. I had one of the most beautiful mornings I've had in a long time here. I'm very grateful that the museum let me come in before it was open so I could really just spend time in a quiet, empty space, really looking deeply at these paintings. And there's something that was incredibly powerful in this body of work that was a real testament to Harmony Hammond as an artist and a human being. I was so moved by her commitment and her belief in painting as a human endeavor that can hold vast amounts of complex and sometimes contradictory association, content, and meaning, but in the terms that are specific to how painting itself functions and form. So as a way of trying to help people hear it, because we have this unique situation where you can hear this conversation and then you can go look for yourself. A lot of the conversation that I'm going to have with Harmony is really grounded in looking at the paintings themselves and different formal aspects or different gestures or different moments in the paintings that I have questions about. And the thing about those aspects of painting, exactly what it looks like, exactly what it is, that is, how paintings disclose themselves. That's how they mean something more than just stuff, And I think in this moment, the exact work that Harmony is doing is so vital, it's so powerful, and it's so important. And I want to help people connect your heart to what I believe is the heart of the painting through this conversation. So the way I want to start Harmony is through the title of the show, which is of course named after one of the paintings. And Harmony is an artist who uses language as a material in just the same way that she uses burlap or oil paint. And as one of our great writers and thinkers and theorists of queer embodiment and also of abstract form. And so you have to take on the titles of the paintings themselves as an extension of the artistic material. So I want to talk a little bit about the implications of the name Fringe, both for that painting and for the show.
Well, for me, fringe, first of all, is a noun and a verb. And it deals with, of course, many associations. One would be people who have been marginalized or exist or operate or occupy spaces either by choice or they're forced to be on the fringes, which are usually in relationship to some other center. However, for me, fringe also calls up edges, and I'm very, very interested in the notion of edges or the meeting points of places. And so again, if you think of fringe, while it does refer to fabrics and certain, textiles and so forth, those loose, it's a place of intersection. It's a place where edges meet, and there's a kind of an energy. I'm interested in the energy at the fringe. I'm interested in the energy on the edges. And when you take that back to painting, or the paintings that are here, there goes my voice, I'm interested in the edges, the outside contours of the paintings are always lumpy and bumpy and irregular, have little things sticking out. So I'm interested in those edges, but I'm also think of painting surface as edge between art and life, basically. So fringe is a way of calling up a sort of social political space that many of us occupy. but it also has references, of course, to fabric and textile, and for me, edges. I mean, I'm really into edges, so that's just kind of it's where I hang out, okay, yeah.
Well, it's also that if you go through the show just looking at the edges, between the internal edge where one aspect of a piece of fabric or a plane touches another and exactly how, and then that leads you to the edge of the painting as an object. And in some cases, as in the painting fringe, those fringes, those kind of incredibly thick, kind of accumulated strands, go off the edge of the frontal plane of the canvas around. And in other places, the textile is really aligned with the edge of the canvas. And then sometimes there's this kind of incursion where there's a zone where you see a kind of linen ground between the edge and between the internal structure. And I think that one thing about how those kind of perimeter edges work, as you had said, it's then starts to speak about the relationship between your body and the space, the painting as object in the room, and how you start dealing with the meeting places of those larger contingent environment.
I'm not sure what the question is, but
Oh wait, there was supposed to be a question?
but there are different kinds of edges.
Yeah, I want to
and
know
that's what
like
you're
about
talking
that.
about.
Yeah.
Well, to take the little painting called Fringe, first of all, it's one of a series of what I call bandaged quilts. So, quilt making traditionally was, gendered activity primarily, and women grabbed any materials. So you can make a quilt out of any kind of material. In this case, it's out of what I call bandages. So it is made out of bandages, and it becomes a bandaged quilt. The bandages are burlap. Now, they are put in a log cabin, traditional log cabin quilting pattern from the outside edge working in, and then there are two of these panels. And I often work in doubles, and that's another question, of course.
It's on my list.
But in this particular painting, as you get in there, some of these bandages are very irregular. They're not straight edges. They're what I call toothy. And they have an edge. And it's a little menacing, but they're also very fragile because of that. And so there are a lot of the edges do that for me, that they're kind of menacing. They stick out, they protrude, they go beyond their own boundaries. It's a little messy, can't contain them. But they're also simultaneously very fragile when they do that. And that's the kind of thing, I don't even think about it when I'm working. It's just kind of what I do a lot, I find.
In terms of the bandaged quilts, there are a number of doubling moves in the work, and you've used doubling for years in the work in various ways. And I was curious about the difference between the double bandaged quilts that are horizontal, like side by side doubling, versus a vertical doubling. And I wanted to know part of like how that changes the implication of the painting or the way we relate to it, to have the doubling on a different axis.
I don't know that it does for me, actually. But then I do use doubling in a number of different ways. So if I'm doubling like kind, so that it is about repetition in time and space, then I'm usually emphasizing sameness and difference. So it's almost a queer read in a certain sense. And because we do read horizontally, most of the double quilts are horizontal. There's only one that is vertical or stacked. But it's still about the stacking, is whether it's vertical or horizontal, it's still about repetition in time and space. When I use doubling of putting two things that are not of like kind together, then I have a consciousness of making them equals, that they sit there, their presence as paintings or surfaces or whatever, one cannot dominate the other. They have to be there equally on the same plane. hold the same presence, which I always think is something I'm working for in the painting. And so what's presence? It's how a work of art occupies a space larger than its physical space. It's more than square inches.
Well, there's another aspect to the doubling that I'm interested in
Yeah.
that I think are actually differences that make a difference. And one of them is in the very large, beautiful double bandaged quilt number 2, which is a kind of yellowish bandaged quilt on the left-hand side and a reddish one on the right-hand side. Those are 2 different stretchers that are very close together but not attached. And this extremely irregular seam between them becomes incredibly charged, where they're very close, there's a doubling, but they're not the same thing. There are other doubles that are on a single stretcher, but the double is unified. And then in between the 2 of those, which is the one that kind of really fucks me up, Fringe itself are 2 different stretchers that are bracketed together, but the bracket with screws, although that bracket is encased in layers of this kind of thick paint so that they have been merged into one thing, but you can see right at the corners and the edge between them, they really hold that space that they're simultaneously different things. And those to me seem like they all have different implications, and I want to know if you could talk a little bit about it.
Well, I'm so glad that you mentioned the crack in the gold and red painting, because it's again I don't know, a visual strategy or something that's in a lot of my work. And it's about, well, first of all, I like those cracks. I like that place of touching. You know, it has it, I'm more interested, in fact, in having it touch and not touch. And what's the feeling of that? I mean, how, you know, when you look at that, I'm hoping that maybe you feel that on your body without intellectualizing it. And so how do we in our bodies interact with other bodies, for instance? So it is very different if there's a doubling and it's on one canvas that I've divided. I can mess with that a little bit in terms of the paint or in a contrast of color or something like that. But I actually like bringing 2 together and having them be, it's like couples. 2 individuals, but also a couple. Right. You know, so, you know, what's that tension? What's that energy that's there? That's something I take great pleasure in.
Right, well, because that they are simultaneously a whole and a pair. And I think that the levels of distance between that becomes thematized by the relation, you know, by the exact degree of the relation between them. And I also think, you know, were I to curate a giant future Harmony Hammond show, I think I would call it attachment theory.
Attachment theory. Ooh, I like that.
Because so much of the show to me is about how the things touch or don't touch and in the ways in which they touch. And you've conjured out of this incredible nuance of a whole vocabulary of touching.
And attachment.
And attachment. Could you talk a little bit about how that has opened for you in this most recent work?
Well, attachment can mean anything, and I mean, can just relate to collage, that process, assemblage, and so forth, which, you know, my work deals with. But sometimes in the more recent work, and I don't always do it, I literally attach, like, domestic linens or something onto the surface. And of course, like all materials that are not, well, even traditional art materials, all materials bring their own histories and memories into the work. So materials and how they're manipulated is one way of bringing content into formal abstraction. So consciously, sometimes I am using linoleum or what we would call domestic linens, and putting them in there because it then situates whatever else is going on in the painting within the domestic environment.
You know, it's really powerful, the moments when you can locate from life, from daily life, this moment within the painting, because so often the textiles, there's this very complex, I want to say striptease almost, between the degrees of legibility of the different elements in their relationship to how painted they are,
Right.
the presence, the lingering presence of the different kinds of weave that might be locatable in certain associations. But when you just see a piece of domestic linen in its whole form, it really hits you the way that this otherwise quote unquote abstract painting is inseparable from our experience of everyday life.
I also think about it, if you think about how those are somewhat attached,
Yeah.
it's very visible how
Yeah.
they're attached.
Yeah.
You can see the push pins glop with paint.
Yeah.
They're just added on the way we add meaning onto paintings. It's a metaphor for that in a certain way. It's also, they hang. I like
Yeah.
things hanging. We hang meaning on works of art. They're also usually loose at the bottom. They create flaps. I love flaps. I love seams. The seams are connectors. They show how things are connected. Flaps indicate a hidden space, something underneath. Again, layers. So so it's a very important aspect of them, and I like attaching things. And when there's even strings or ropes occasionally in the paintings, they too they all speak to possibilities, in a sense, for me. So if there's a rope or strings, something could be tied, or it could be being untied. The grommets, the ropes, they speak of possibilities of being tied down, tied up, bound, or unbound.
And I find within different moments of the paintings that the implication switches between being the binding as feeling a kind of positive securing thing or oppressive, and the untying as being a liberation, but also at other times very gutting. I mean, there's that painting Various Things Various, where it's like the untied rope. I was just like, ugh.
I know, kind of vulnerable.
Yeah. So I have a question that also relates to the rope, which is in the very first gallery on the left-hand side, there's this amazing painting called Double Cross 3 that has a piece of wood with a kind of pattern notched into it that is leaning against the face of the painting. And on top of that is rested this coil of rope. And there's a number of things that are interesting to me about that, partly because having a piece of wood lean on the face of a painting is like it's like both funny and scary, where you're like, oh no, like don't fuck up the painting. And then it also creates this bridge between your body in the room and the face of the painting as a material surface. And then the thing about this rope that's so fabulous is it's just kind of rested there in the way that the wood is kind of rested there. So there's this kind of contingency feeling, like a kind of precious balance of it. And then this rope comes down and it has this tufted end that just caresses the face of the painting. And that's another way of bringing in a kind of touch that also becomes a kind of metaphor for the brush, the touch of the brush, which was once present but now absent in the making of the surface. And I want to know more about that particular piece and how you thought about leaning that onto the front of it.
Well, you brought up a number of interesting things, because I think that tuft at the end of both ends of the rope, actually, I like that you brought it up, like in relation to a paintbrush. I think of it, excuse me, my voice, I'm sorry, everybody, but I think of it as also very much like the tufting of the chenille paintings, or the paintings that I call the chenille series, which reference patterns on chenille bedspreads, tufted raised patterns. So for me, there's that connection. The other thing is, I'm just going to start in the way that you started this conversation. So what do we got there in that painting? First of all, we have a traditional stretcher bar, traditional canvas stretched, the traditional modernist rectangle. And that's true in most of these works. That's what they're starting with. So that for me is an indication that I am situating this work within a narrative of modernist abstract painting. And like, don't forget it, okay? And
Deal with it.
Yeah, so deal with it. And then Then the other things I do, the way I use materials and how I use them, what I call material engagement, is what brings content into that painting field. And while it engages with the painting field and its history, hopefully interrupts it in some way, okay, with content, which is usually not welcome in that kind of other formal conversation. So in that particular painting, we know, well, we haven't talked about it here, but a lot of the paintings either include, other than art canvas, they include canvas that was used as a mat cover from Aikido, the Japanese martial art that I studied for 36 years. So it either is that canvas which has brought the grommets and the straps in, and then later, following on that material, I've been using a lot of burlap coffee sacks. In some of the big I'm sorry, this is a long answer. Okay, but in a lot of the cross paintings, the coffee sacks have just been opened up as is, and they form that intersection or that crossing. In the painting that you're talking about, the seams are the double cross.
Right.
Yeah, it's a double cross, but the seams are the double cross. I'm playing with a number of things, but in a very loose way. I like to do what I call like suggested narratives. There's no whole story there, but there's a possibility of different narratives. So for me, some of that comes from that double cross, which suggests betrayal, perhaps. It suggests doubling, but it and sameness and difference, but it also suggests betrayal. So that goes back to the language thing you were talking about. And then I've often used wood. So for me, the gesture of putting a piece of wood and leaning something against a painting is not an unusual thing for me to do. I have a history of what I call mixed media installational paintings, which have all kinds of things leaning on each other. But that goes back to the other thing you brought up about not just touching, but leaning on each other. And there's a weight to the cross. Is it holding up that painting?
Right.
And I almost like it as thinking of it as a prop.
As a prop, yeah.
That
it feels that way.
Props like it, yes. But it also has this wonderful, crude, decorative step thing. So the way you were talking about it, I think, Jarrett, that you could maybe in your body feel like you were walking up that. It could be a spine, but it helps you enter up into the painting. So it almost, in some very weird way, is a kind of religious, because you walk up those things.
Now you're talking my language.
The crosses, and there's a rope, you know.
Well, okay, so I don't want to, for me, attachment theory and bodies and desire are kind of hovering all over this show, and there are different ways I want to get at that, but I think it becomes pinpointed or thematized most clearly in the more recent painting called Voices, in which you have the pieces of printed linoleum with texts on them. And in this very center of the text, it says, "If desire could liberate itself." And by chance this morning, I was happening to read my Norton Anthology of World Religions, and I was reading the section of early Buddhist texts, and there's this story that the Buddha tells that is about what he calls 5 chords of sensual experience that bind us, and that it is the path of being on the Buddha as to. And he actually describes it to being like a fawn bound in ropes in a forest, and then you're vulnerable to whomever you want. And it's like sensual desire. So it's like looking with your eyes, what you smell, what you taste, the senses. And it's like, we got to cut those cords. And in a strange way, I brought that into the experience of the show this morning with all of the bindings and the straps and the things that are held together. And not to necessarily put a negative implication on that, but it seemed to me very clear that there is a connection between your interest in desire and embodiment and the kind of strapping, suturing, touching. And I want to know more about that as a formal and conceptual dynamic.
Well, going back to the strapping and stuff, I forgot to mention it before, but, yes, the straps and the grommeted straps do suggest, restraint, constraint, binding, bondage, all that circulates around it. But at the same time, in the smallest, earliest painting here in the show, the straps go around the painting. I very often consciously put the straps, I'm wrapping the painting. We could call it not binding or bondage, we could call it embracing. If you really look at the straps in my painting, they're not that tight. They're not that tight at all. So I think of it, the painting, as the painting body, and it is being embraced, or even when bandaging. Well, I mean, bandaging is often helpful, on an injury or so forth. So all of those associations circulate around the work. And I don't start out to make a painting about any one of them. I just know that's kind of the vocabulary I work with. And when I sit back and look at what I'm doing, those are the kind of associations that bring the content into the work. But it's usually, multiple, as you said. Yeah.
Well, also the straps or the strips are often embedded in deep layers of paint
Right.
that kind of encrust them, encode them, and add this kind of skin, unifying skin over the top of them. So it feels like it is an emanation of the thing rather than just an alien exterior application.
Right.
And one of the things that became really moving to me, and this has to do with the excellent installation and lighting in the show, so congratulations to everyone here who did that, is what became the most powerful formal dynamic was the relationship of the texture of the underlying materials and how they related to the texture of the surface of the paint on top of them. Because the way that you deal with the kind of paint, is it mixed with Dorland wax?
With Dorland's wax, which some of you know is a cold wax, so it's a paint extender.
And it has this body to it that in and of itself, I want to talk about the aspects of the body of the paint, but it leaves the texture of the brush all over that relate in complex ways to the patterns of the different weaves underneath. And that in and of itself felt like one of the major formal fulcrums. And I want to hear you talk about that.
Well, I think it's a really great observation. Thank you. Well, first of all, burlap sacks in and of themselves, it's just, there's other fabrics in there, but they're primarily the burlap. And what the reason I like the burlap is, of course, because it has so much texture. But all burlap sacks do not have the same texture. They're not the same color. They don't have the same texture. But they are used. The reason I'm grabbing them is not because I'm making pieces about coffee and, or something like that. No, but rainforest, somebody else might use coffee sacks for that. That I'm grabbing them because of their texture, because of their formal qualities. And the way I apply paint, the texture that I use with the brush is actually different from painting to painting. It's not the same. And it's something I have to always pay attention to, because it actually matters a lot.
And it's something that you can see uniquely in a large show like this.
Yeah.
And that's why this show is so incredible. Because if you see one or two of
You
the
don't see the
paintings,
difference
you
then.
don't understand the nuance.
Right. But the other thing that you mentioned, which is really crucial to my process, is I don't just put burlap down and then I just paint, or then I just wrap. It's not all done as one process and another process and another process. It's a back and forth process. So the straps are embedded in the layers of thick paint. Sometimes they're pulled off, and then you have a scab. Then you have a trace,
A
of
missing
something that was
attachment.
there.
Yeah, when you notice
Yeah.
that, it's like, oof.
Yeah, and so it's about embedding it and going back and forth and building that surface with fabric being added and also with paint until I just get it to that place that I want it, which is that kind of magical place. But things like brush strokes are so interesting too, because we all know, one of the things that's wonderful about oil paint is how light hits and activates the brush strokes. So how do I do it? You know, and I mean, is it going to be about beautiful painting, or am I putting it on like a stucco wall? Am I dabbing it? It too can have little points or protrusions that are menacing or decorative or fragile. So all of those are considerations. I also want to say at this point, because I think of, like I said, the painting as a painting body, and I think that there's an element of violence in the work, and healing sometimes is necessary. So I think of the paint itself as a poultice that metaphorically heals whatever else is going on in the painting. And so if the paint can be a poultice, and we can deal about, say that the paintings deal with certain kinds of violences in terms of marginalized voices or in women's bodies or whatever it is, then the paint itself can act as a healing agent or a bandaging in a sense, but a poultice. And therefore we can talk about painting itself as an activity being a healing agent. We can take it out, from the center out.
Well, I think that the sensitivity of the painting itself is a huge place where I personally experience the eroticism or the sensuality within the paintings that I feel like is more thematic in the idea of the attaching, but it's something about the way it's put together through the paint. And I kind of want to still linger on the question of desire, because it has been such a big, it's been such a animating force in your theorization of the work. And also desire is always attended by a kind of violence.
Yes, and I also, like you mentioned, there are many kinds of desire, of course.
Right.
Okay. This particular painting, Voices, started a long time ago, I think in the early 90s or something, I forget the dates. But anyway, I found these pieces of vintage linoleum. At this point, I was doing work from materials that I picked, actually, from abandoned farms in southern New Mexico. And so I was using corrugated, rusted roofing tin and so forth. But also these houses were abandoned, so I was going in and ripping up the linoleum floors. And of course, a lot of that old linoleum breaks into fabric fragments and pieces. So I was taking these small fragments that I had, and I just started writing on them with oil stick. And the quotes, because what I was reading at that time was Trinity Minha, Lucy Rigare, and the quotes that are in here are from Monique Wittig. So, the question of what have you done with our desire is the title of one of a major essay of hers. But it also, in that essay, she sort of proposes or thinks out loud, like, you know, if desire could liberate itself from the binary sexes, if desire could liberate it, and she's speaking as a lesbian feminist, if desire could liberate itself from reproduction, what would it be? Mm-hmm. You know, and what would it be if it could liberate itself from the sexes? Because for Wittig, woman, a lesbian is not a woman, because a woman is a social construct. So that's all that history is. And then to talk about the painting, because these were just phrases that I love because they're so powerful, but they're also poetic. That's what's really great. And I was just scrawling them on these fragments. So they were fragmented quotes, basically. And at that time, then these fragments of linoleum with their quotes could be rearranged and push-pinned on the wall in different ways. Well, long story short, it never was a piece that was finished. So during COVID, when, like a lot of us were shut in our studios for a while, happily so, I started pulling things out of drawers and boxes, and I found these linoleum fragments. And, you know, like I said, I never felt it got resolved as a work of art. So I started bringing them, and again, layering them together, putting these fragments, they're kind of like cartoon bubbles, you know, putting them together and with pieces of the linoleum. And also you'll notice in there's the underside of the linoleum that I'm interested in. So I'm bringing all those thoughts, those conversations together that are written on there, but then that linoleum brings in the domestic environment, and then my feeling is that the material, what violences went on in that house?
Well, it also does this kind of inversion of the ground to the floor, of the wall to the ground.
With the floor wall
Yeah.
is always a thing in the work, but also the underside. I'm interested in the backside, the underside, what's buried, what's hidden. And I always think that the underside of linoleum is as beautiful as the pattern side. So I'm playing with a lot of that different stuff. And the last thing I would just say is that for me then, by presencing Monique Wittig and the lesbian feminist voice, I am basically saying that is one of the disenfranchised or marginalized or erased voices that's underneath the thick paint in the other paintings. It's giving visibility to one of many different kinds of disenfranchised voices. And so it's just kind of revealing what metaphorically it's a more overtly political painting. The other works deal with the same issues, but in a much more conceptual way.
And that's one of the things that's so powerful about having an exhibition, is like letting the works inflect each other from one to the next. Right. There's something I want to ask you about the kind of layering of for instance, like the pieces of linoleum, but across the work, there's this aspect that the paintings are like very low reliefs, and sometimes the relief comes forward in various ways. And because of the way that they are lit quite dramatically with spots, what happens is that these kind of shadows emerge. And I think one thing about shadows to me is that they have a kind of graphic quality. They're almost like a drawing. And so you get these kind of dark lines that appear in some of the pieces. And it also makes you realize about how contingent the painting is on its environment for that aspect of it to come forward or to recede. And in that sense, it suddenly has me thinking about the painting as contingent in the way that like the thing's leaning on the front, but also about how paintings exist in time. I really think that they are a time-based medium. They're not linear, but they disclose themselves sequentially in time. And I just want to hear a little bit about the shadows, the contingency, and how you think about the time of it.
Well, in most places, it depends where they're hung and so forth. So they certainly do change with the time of day or with lighting and all of those issues. The shadows are really, really important to me in the painting. I mean, highlights are as well, but especially the shadows, both again, like what's in the shadows. There's all of those associations. But they do work formally, like you said. Okay, so I like to have them installed in a show with lighting that's similar to how I painted them, because there are just very quick formal decisions about a cast shadow relates to this dark piece of fabric down here or something like that. But the idea of the shadows, who occupies the shadows is really important for sure. And then but the shadows are on the surface. And I also have, in many of the paintings, openings. Those grommeted holes open up the surface. So they function pictorially, again, to suggest a space underneath. Well, the surface is just a skin of paint. All painting is a skin of paint. It's a skin. Okay? So underneath there is a space alluded to. And that's where those other voices, or culture, cultural traditions and so forth, are buried underneath there and can assert themselves through this what I call a consciously agitated surface, of material intimacy, and yet. So that's why through the grommet holes you might see what seem like body fluids oozing out, or the surface, this agitated surface, might feel stained by something underneath. So it's always about what's buried under there as well as the surface. And I like very much that because of this notion of the paintings being in, quote, in relief, that they occupy this third or queer space between painting and sculpture. Most of my work just does. Again, I rarely think about that when I'm working, but it just is kind of the space I inhabit. Yeah.
Well, as you were describing that, it makes me think, I feel that the adamant way you position them within a certain tradition of painting, and of course, the most obvious has to do with modernist grid, but that also is contingent on this long armature of the history of easel painting, oil painting in the United States, or I mean in the world. And I think the subject matter of oil painting in that long tradition is always about this problem of embodiment. And you think about even like the Titian late painting of the Flaying of Marsyas, where he explains everything. It's like you're watching a body get the skin peeled off of it, and it's like about what oil painting does, because a painting also makes something present that isn't really there. And I think that kind of play between what you see and you don't see, what opens into your mind through looking at the painting, that's on the deepest structural level painting's job as a technology. And so I see what you're doing as related to this long history of painting as a cultural human activity.
And abstract painting and near monochrome painting. You know, most of these are what I call near monochrome, so they are either becoming or unbecoming monochrome again. But what it allows me to do is to not be confined by the figure, by representation, illustration. I'm not confined by the contours of the figure, which is, of course, a lot of queer art. It deals with representation and the figure, and therefore surveillance and who's looking at who. So I can push all that aside and just deal with the body as a social political site through the materials and not be limited by the contours of the figure.
The last question I want to ask you before I think some people might have questions, is it goes back to the question of time in the painting, because on two levels. Because of course, one thing about painting is that it's present in the moment that it's made, and it discloses that time of its own making through how the hand is present, the brushwork is present, and it does this. It's a strange knot where it kind of remains forever in both. It's suspended present from the past, but always experienced in the future. It's always directed towards the future. So it's a complicated thing. But the other thing that one feels when looking at a survey of an artist like this is the time, the amount of time that went into it that's just someone's life. And for me, that is part of the ground zero of what makes it meaningful or value, is that you've spent your entire life doing this thing. And I want to know, at this moment, what it's like for you to look back at different paint, your own history, to bring that forward into the present of your work, and also your own embodiment. Like, I think that a lot of these new paintings have to do with temporality and time in relationship to embodiment and aging. And I would love to hear about it.
I've lost track. You said so many wonderful things here.
Nothing like an easy question at the end.
Right. Well, I do, first of all, I'm just a worker. I like working. I like making work in the studio. So I kind of, for better or worse, that's what I do, okay? So that isn't something separate from who I am and my body and my life, as is other things that I do with my body in my life. They kind of do, I know it sounds corny, but they really are all part of one thing. This kind of looking at the work over a long trajectory, which you were sort of doing, I've been very, very lucky as an artist to be invited many places to do, visiting artist lectures on my work. And for me, as for other artists who get to do that, it's really a privilege, because it's given me an opportunity. Because people, when you go and visit, do a visiting artist talk, they want you to, it's usually just students, and they want you to start at the beginning.
Yeah, and they don't know anything.
And well, no, sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But anyway, I'm not, yeah. But anyway, you're trying.
Got to start at the beginning.
You got to start. They don't like it. I've tried other things, they want to start at the beginning because you're kind of saying, you're letting them know kind of how you got going or what you were thinking of, and that they too can do this. You're giving permission for them to do it in some way. But what I get out of that is I get to revisit my work over a period of time. So I do have a sense of a body of my work. I do have a sense, as I keep saying even here today, of certain, they can be threads, visual strategies, they can be threads of content, of whatever. I have some sense of that because I get to revisit it. And I get to talk to you about it, and I get to answer questions about it. But still, even though I have that, and I value that a lot, because not all artists have that. Sometimes they don't have a sense of their own body of work. I know what I've done, more than what's out here. But what a show like this, what's so wonderful is, also I'm very privileged and I'm very lucky that work does go out into the world. It does leave my studio. And when you have a show like this, any kind of a survey exhibition, you can bring work back and you can put it together. And even working with the staff here as we were placing works, and what do you see through a doorway in relation to what's on the left and the right and behind you and all those things. There were many new things that I saw because we were able to bring these paintings together. Like I said last night, I feel like it's kind of bringing the girls home,
Woo!
And I can see them, and I can see these connections. But I also, just because I've worked so fucking long, that I trust my work process. I know the work is connected. I don't have anxiety about that. I don't worry about that. I just know that it's there because and this goes way back, I trust that it's all connected in some way, and I trust that there's an audience for it because I know I'm not unusual. Other people have the same or similar experiences, so hopefully can relate to the work in some way. And I also, another important thing I learned really, really early on, when a really difficult period in my life, and the one thing I had at that time that was totally mine was my work. And I learned at that time that was something that the work would never take me someplace I couldn't handle. And once you know something like that, you can just go with it. You can just go with it.
Exactly. In a different context, this would be the moment where you just raise the mic and drop it, and we'll walk off the stage. But because we're in this context, I think people can ask some questions.
So the one thing I didn't hear discussed that I see as fairly important in the work is color.
It was on my list. Thank you for bringing it up. Color.
Well, it's interesting because, again, in that overall trajectory, which I'll say first, is I find that I tend to work in, and this is over the years.
Wait, use your microphone.
Oh, yes, thank you. I tend to work in like maybe earth tones, más o menos, and then I'll do a body of work which is a much broader, brighter palette. And I seem to go in and out of that. That's just one of those shifts that I see that happens for whatever. Here, however, as I said, these are what I call near monochrome paintings, so that from a distance they look monochrome. Up close you see a lot of other color pushing through, or in one way or another. And so there's a lot more going on when you get up close. I also, many of the paintings are very consciously, because of the content I've talked about here, what I call an off-white or warm white. And I'm using that metaphorically as white, so that the disenfranchised voices, some of them coming through, are upsetting that warm, white, comfy, chenille bedspread surface, and that there's something a little menacing or violent. There's a rupture from underneath that whiteness.
consideration in all the colors, whether it's, the off-whites, the beige, or the more color. It seems like, just as a painter.
The kind of gray slip color. I actually came out of this show thinking that you were an incredible colorist, which is not necessarily a thought that I had before. But I think it also had to do with this most recent body of work. I don't know if it's 15 or 20 years, the nuance and you seeing together, there's an incredibly complicated color sensibility there.
I don't know. I mean,
color,
obviously I use color, but it's not. And I have an awareness. I have an awareness of color, but it's not. I don't feel like that's the place where I hang out particularly. But this kind of a clay color, for instance, it's literally, I call it buff.
Yeah.
So it is a buff color, which I like again because it's kind of like, buff. I mean, in buff, we can just play with that, like you can play with fringes and flaps and things. But anyway, so it's buff, honey, okay? But buff is also like a skin color, but it's not a specific skin color. So the two colors that you see most often are the off-white or warm white, and then buff. And then, of course, I use red. And there's multiple kinds of red.
Right.
But when we see red, of course, it calls up things like blood. It calls up passion. It calls up here, red earth. So what are our associations that we all bring because of who we are and where we were born and where we live and the cultures that we make and inhabit? What are our interpretations of color? But I do use buff and the off-white and often a red in there because I also believe that a lot of, whether it's paint, whether it's art, whether it's creative practices that we do, whether it's political protest, I am using it as a reference to blood because I feel blood is shed in all of these activities.
Well, also, one of the things about, to go back to the relationship between language and phenomenal experience, the French historian Michel Pastoureau, who wrote this incredible social history of color in multi-volumes, he maintains that linguistically, in almost every language, the first color term that was used to designate any color is always red. And he theorizes that as the first color, and partly because its relationship to blood and probably to fire, but also birth and, it's there. Like that's the first social term we needed to denote a color was for red because of the complexity of everything that color did in our life. And so I think the primacy of the red, it's followed very closely. It changes in different languages, but it's attended very closely by black and by white. And so those are that's your palette, and I think that there's a way, the earth tones, paint is earth. That's what it is in its deepest, most pure form. And so I think that the clay, the kind of slip, and then you have all these relationships because then it can become about a body, but then it opens up into a landscape.
Right.
And so I think that and the other thing is mostly you intellectualized and articulated your thoughts about the color. I also think color is mostly unconscious. From years of teaching painting students, I don't think you can teach it. You cannot help someone make bad color relationships. It's just you got it or you don't. And that's not fair. But that's life. Is there maybe one more question, this person in the middle? Oh, wait, okay, this person, that person, and this person.
Hi, Harmony.
Hi there, Jen.
Thanks so much for this talk. I just wanted to ask about a piece that I didn't hear you say much about that was in kind of what I'm thinking as the middle room, but I don't remember what it was called, but I did read the wall text. It had these pieces of like gauze that you would use to clean red brushes all over it.
Right.
I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about how that piece came about, which I think is related to the blood conversation. Then also about how you choose what materials you identify in your labels and what you don't. Thank you.
Okay, well, the label thing, first of all, usually gets, in most places, because we don't like too long a labels, gets translated to something like oil and mixed media on canvas or something. But it can be broken down to given all the materials if necessary. But that particular painting, she's talking about what we might refer to as the quilt painting. And okay, so again, stretcher bars, stretched canvas, a quilt cover, not a whole quilt, that has been kicking around. And during COVID isolation, pulled it out of a drawer. Don't know where I got it anymore. I've been dragging it around since I moved here from New York. I think it's not like my grandmother's quilt or something, in other words. It is just a quilt cover that I think was in a bag of fabric that I got at a yard sale or something. All right. Now I'm looking at it, and of course, quilts have this wonderful history. I have worked with them before, so they have a gendered history. They have the grid. I mean, all the ingredients are like really there. And if you look even at the kind of, I never saw it white, but kind of that cream color and the red. The cream color, as it turns out, is a cross form in there, which I wasn't aware of immediately. But I started to work, I pulled out this quilt, and I always just thought I'd use it somewhere, sometime, somehow. And as luck, I guess, would have it, I was priming a canvas that was on the floor, and lo and behold, it fit right on there. And then, but because the quilt also was old, it was falling apart, it was fraying, it's disintegrating, and the stitching, so you can even see on the quilt, it doesn't all stay perfectly aligned like it's supposed to. And when I have now archivally fixed it onto that painting rectangle or off square, it also, it's almost kind of pushing. It's like it kind of doesn't want to stay there. It wants to go beyond the edges or off the surface a little bit. So I did repair it, but not by sewing. I repaired it by patching with other cream color, mostly cream, but some of the red color patches, and you can see that they are archivally glued in place. So it's that patching and healing the quilt, which is a gendered form of creativity, referring to that tradition of quilt making. Okay, so now we've got the quilt and we've got that on there. Then the pieces that you're talking about, Jen, they look off at first like they're pieces of the cream color squares in the quilt, that they're the same size. If you look closely, they're not the same size and they're not the same fabric. So there's already this violence to the quilt over time, and there's already a mending and a healing. But then in the center, I've taken these little pieces of cotton fabric that were given to me by the artist Alice Briggs. When her father died, she was going through all his things, and she mailed me, because she knew I'd use them, this box of these little they're very soft, like bandage, very soft squares of cotton that are used as gun wipes at rifle target practice. I've never done it, but apparently after you shoot, you clean the barrel of your gun. So you don't have to know that to look at the painting, I believe, but it is another layer of meaning that is there, which are these little, what seem like soft little gauzy things that you'd put on a sore, actually are connected to guns and violence and rifles. Now, to go back to what you also said, is so Harmony has these around, and I'm very grateful because, Alice was on the mark. I can use these. And they just sit out on a table in the studio, and I clean my red paintbrushes on them. And so sometimes you'll see some that the red paint sits very much on the surface, and other it's just kind of a stain. Like they're stained, they're there, and but they're only this big. And then I put them in the middle of the quote, negative cross spaces on the quilt cover. But before I did that, I also took a razor and put a very gendered slit cut down the red that's there. So it was calling for me, what came together in the painting was a referencing of continued, because when you have the grid, is continual, repetitive violence to women's bodies is presenced here, and a kind of violence that's been done to the tradition of women and quilting. And so I'm referencing those two things together. And the bottom section where there's a grid, you know, I often think of these grommets as orifices, first of all. They're places of passage, body fluids go through, but another orifice are eyes. So I almost think of that kind of, you know, what do I want to call it, the bottom, that bottom area, as bearing witness. But that's my thoughts on that painting.
Is that it? All right.
Thank
you all
everybody.
for being here.